To give me tough. All right, so today we'll be talking about integrating external applications with Content Hub. This is not related to XP, so I'm not going to talk about all the stuff Sumit does with the CMP and the DAM connector. My name is Akshay Sura, so I've been doing Sitecore for quite a bit. And if you guys need any guidance or anything like that in the community, I'm more than happy to help and pretty much reachable on every social channel. Getting right into it. So there's two major ways of integrating into Content Hub. One of it is via REST-based API, just like every REST-based API. You don't really need to bring anything in. The APIs are well documented. You can mix and match as much as you want, and you can create whatever functionality you decide. So there's a lot of flexibility, but you have to work at an API level. So a lot of wiring up things which you probably haven't done using Sitecore in a long time. So it's more like having a recipe essentially. So you have to follow the recipe, but once you get the recipe, you can make a pancake or a muffin for that matter. You don't have to make a cake. The REST-based API is pretty well documented. So pretty much all the documentation on Style Labs is pretty decent once you know the basic concepts of Content Hub. You go through a little bit of training, things fall into place, and the more you use it, the easier it gets. So I would definitely recommend it. It's my new passion. So I'm trying to work a lot on Content Hub. In order to make these calls, you need a user as well as an OAuth client secret. So it's pretty easy. Once you get the access to the console, Content Hub console, you should be able to create a user, give appropriate permissions. Also, you could create a new OAuth client or steal one from an existing one. You need the client secret. Essentially, what you'll be doing is using the values of the user as well as the client secret to get an authentication token and then make subsequent calls in order for you to achieve whatever functionality you're trying to achieve. And again, like I mentioned, API is fairly well documented. You can go take a look. The second part of it, when we get to the SDK side, there is a JavaScript SDK, and until today, I didn't really look into it, but I did today. So it does provide quite a few libraries. So with the npm install, you could install it on your React, Angular, whichever you use to consume the npm libraries, and then you get access to these pre-built functionalities which you can call to make whatever you need to. One of the things, and again, I have not looked into it quite a bit, but the thing which scared me the most, and today I was working on yet another blog post on using Content Hub as a CMS, and Sumit's ears will perk up when I say this. It is not CAS, but anyway, so when I was looking at it, and I was trying to look at the JavaScript SDK, and I don't really know how they do it until I look into this, is I was kind of concerned in terms of how I pass these values, right? Just the sheer name of JavaScript SDKs. There's something on the client, something which you can inspect and look into from a client's perspective. So I'm kind of curious to see how the credentials are being passed up. But again, this is...
They do expire very quickly. So you have to keep asking for the token.
Yeah, still though.
So the idea is on the server side, you would ask for the token and you'd pass the token onto the client side and it would use the script and it would only be a short window.
Yeah, so then there's no point, right, if I have to have a server side. Anyways, so you know how I feel about that. But it's well documented as well, so you can go take a look at that. The next way is using the Web Client SDK. And again, this is an external library. You'll be pulling it in from a NuGet package. There's pre-built functionality. Makes life a lot easier. So it's almost like a box of cake where you just mix it in, throw it in the oven, and you're done. The documentation, again, like other parts of this Style Labs documentation, is pretty well documented. The actual NuGet feed you get from like a gated NuGet feed, and once you add the source, you should be able to easily pull it in. There are some samples out there. This is an old one, but it gives you an idea of what to do. I still haven't included yours, Chris. Chris has his on his GitHub, which gives you an example of from a PCM perspective, but essentially you can log in, you're creating an item or two, gives you an idea, but all of these examples kind of guide you on how you can get started. So it's pretty easy. One of the things Chris had pointed out from an earlier user group is even though you're using the Web Client SDK, you can still make raw API calls using the SDK as a base. So you're still not limited in that way. But I have not found a limitation myself in all the things I've done that I had to use something other than just the plain Web Client SDK myself at this moment. There are three main entities. There's several entities, but the three main I wanted to call out, the M.Asset, which is digital asset management, M.PCM.product, which is the product content management, and M.content, which is the content marketing platform. So these are the three main assets. There's several others. So for PCM, you're dealing with catalogs and product families. For content, you're dealing with content types and other relationships. So it gets pretty interesting once you get into it, but at first when I was trying to create things, I was running into brick walls, and then Content Hub provides different ways for you to figure out what exactly is happening currently. So it makes your life easier, and you can actually figure your way out, which we'll take a look at. An interesting thing I wanted to show you. So back in the old SQL days, I haven't written a SQL statement in a long, long time, but they were relationships, right? One-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-many. So same thing with a Content Hub perspective. There's several relationships you could have on an entity relating to other entities. And all of that happens with relationship objects in between. So on the entity itself, you define the relationship. It'll go and you assign properties appropriately to specify what the relationship is. And I wanted to show you a slide in terms of relationships, but when we actually look at the JSON of an entity, you'll understand it a little bit more. So from a demo perspective, let's take a look here. Sorry, let me go here, leave. So I'm not sure how many of you have seen Content Hub. This is an instance which I spun up. Again, this is by default, this is what you see, but pretty much anything you see in here can be customizable. Think of it, it's a website SaaS offering, right? So you want it to look like the branding you use every day. You want it to act like the branding. So you could customize screens to your content as much as you want, and you should be able to do that. And again, there's several pieces to Content Hub. One of them is PCM. So you're maintaining catalogs. You could maintain product families, which are basically categories. And then you can have products themselves. And I haven't really customized any of these yet, but you could customize all the entities using their schema. So you can add more attributes. You could link them to other things like assets and other pieces of content. Depending on what your business need is, how you currently store your data, how do you need to store your data to fulfill your content needs is totally up to you. And that's what will end up coming once you start building the domain model. In here, you could see that in the UI, once you get used to it, you get used to it, but you have several panels. You could have logic where you could hide some panels based on the data being selected from another field, things of that sort. All of them have workflows, and you can define your own custom workflows if you need to. In here with the product, you can obviously link to assets from the DAM, content from CMP, so that works. To me, one of the more complicated or a lot more functionality exists in DAM for me, and it can get complicated depending on what you're trying to do. As you can see, DAM has all of a sudden has a lot more panels, so it's kind of scary, but it's not at the same time. So here you see a products detail panel, but maybe we could toggle this based on a content type, and if the type is of a certain type, then maybe we can hide it. If it's not of a certain type, we can show it. So you can make the UI a little bit easier and simpler. Assets are also a little bit more complicated because depending on what you choose to do with them. So like, for instance, image processing, if you once someone uploads an image, you want to do X, Y, and Z, and you want to have a ultra super compressed version, the smallest file size version, and you want to do a lot of this. So you would be doing media processing. So it can get complicated, but you basically start at the base and you slowly add more functionality. The next piece is the actual CMP. So CMP is all about content. You could define the metadata or like the schema for a piece of content, and you could extend it. You could have multiple fields, different types. So as you can see, this is a specific piece of content. This is of type user group, and we'll be adding one for the current user group to see how exactly it gets done. But here we have a couple of fields. Again, most of the fields on the content side are all text-based, so single, multi, and rich text. You could add assets related to this if you want to. The stuff on the right is the details panel. So here you could add fields to this and extend it. These fields can get pretty complicated and you get different types of this, and we'll take a look at that. From a management perspective, depending on how much you do stuff, so you can live in this screen for a long period of time. So like actions, triggers, content type, schema is something which you spend quite a bit of time in, taxonomy, depending on what you're doing. So if you look into content types, by default, you get advertisement, blog, email, recipe, social media, webinar, and white paper, I think, if I'm not wrong. Not webinar, probably white paper, but you can add custom types. Like you can see, I've added a user group with 3 fields in it. As I mentioned, these fields on the content end, which you saw on the left, are specific types. You can't have as many types as you want, but the details group is a lot more complicated. So you could go ahead and add more logic to it. So for instance, options list is, if you have drop-down list of a small set of values, you can add it as an option list. If you have a bigger set of, essentially drop-down or tree list text, if you're talking about from a Sitecore perspective, but it's hierarchical, taxonomy is a good way to do it, and it can get a little bit complicated depending on who you're connecting to and all of that fun stuff. But this is the basis of quite a few other things. And now if you take a look at schema, let's look at asset. And as you see, there's quite a bit of attributes associated with a piece of an entity, and you can extend it. You could do quite a bit of things, but you can't willy-nilly, just like how a lot of people do with templates. You can't just add things, remove them, and think that it'll be hunky-dory. You got to think of it from a content perspective, content production, and not hoping to make changes every 2 seconds to your schema, because it will affect other things. Because you have to think of, you're not dealing with 1 or 2 pieces of content. Think about thousands of pieces of content, and if you make a mistake, and you'll be screwing up a lot of content. What I also wanted to show you, and this is where quite a bit of time goes into play. So I used to waste quite a lot of time when it came into hitting brick walls. So how exactly do I do that? So one of the things which is very interesting, and this screen actually saved me a lot of time, is you can actually look at an entity from a raw perspective. So this is the exact same thing, but as you can see, I can see a lot more. It gives you an idea of what is being stored for this specific entity. You can see that some of these fields which are added by default in the system are pretty, but my fields, you can notice there's a difference. My fields also do not have any locale or culture specific values. So you can see straight values there, but as you can see, this one is a cultured value. So in US culture has a specific value. So you could have both sets of things. As you can also see that this entity relates to another entity, so which is content type, and it is linked to a content type which is of ID 39004. You can go there and you can look at that content type. So this content type is of type user group, and so on and so forth. So it kind of gives you an idea when you get stuck and like, oh, I'm not able to add like a I'm not able to make it in progress. I'm not able to make it an active state or add a content type. And you figure it out based on the schema, how exactly it's laid out. It's actually super simple to me anyways. Once you start playing with it, it gets very easy. So let's take a look at adding one of these and walking through. So just add some of the info. So essentially we're trying to create a user group, and we will look at the code and create a user group. And then where do I go? Come back here. And as you can see, and it seems like I haven't really done anything, which I really haven't. Once you get into this, it's actually super easy. It's not hard at all. And the piece of content gets added, not a lot of effort involved. So let me go through the code and I'll walk you through one other thing as well. So here, what I'm trying to do in my world, I do most of my work in Azure functions, and I'll tell you why in a second. You could have it in your own application, depending on the amount of data or the type of process you're trying to do. So assume you're pushing 20, 30,000 media assets to Content Hub. Probably your local isn't the best place to do it. Or a local app running locally isn't the best place to do it, but it truly depends on what you're trying to do. So in this case, essentially, when that form submits, it's adding a message in a JSON format to an Azure queue, and this function gets triggered. And in here, we're deserializing that into a user group. And again, all of these are pretty simple types. There's nothing complicated in this, trust me. So we're trying to get a connection to Content Hub. We're trying to impersonate a user because we want to try to create a piece of content from a user's perspective, so it flows the same way as if someone created a content by the user. So all the workflows will be followed and things of that sort. Here we're basically saying create an entity of a specific type, and all of these are very, very basic. So it's entity specific type to the entity. And then we are assigning values. So in this case, since it's not a culture specific value, I can straight away say, okay, this is a field name, and then specify the value for it. If it was culture specific, you would specify the culture and the field name and the value. Here, what we're trying to do is we're trying to say, I want to add a relationship which is one-to-one from a child to a parent of type content type to content. And if you go here, you notice this label is exactly the same as the schema we saw in the JSON. And then I'm adding the basically the user group type as the ID, as the parent. That's how it links it. Here, again, we're doing a child to parent of the content lifecycle, trying to put it in progress. And then here, the state, we're setting it for an active state or approved for creation. And again, all of these, this one is a one-to-many, but all of these are text-based keys. So when you look at it from a blog perspective, which is an inbuilt field, inbuilt content type, you see the definition looks pretty. Mine doesn't look as pretty because it's a custom one. The field names of mine look a little bit weird as compared to the pretty ones here. But essentially, you're doing the same exact job. Now, coming back to why I do it via a Azure function as opposed to a .NET app locally is it truly depends on what you're trying to do, right? So I'm not going to walk through the entire code, but this is a piece of code which creates assets, and assets, as you know, can be like 1 meg, it could be 50 meg, it could be 500 meg, depending on how big your asset is. And as part of creating an asset, you would do the same exact thing, pretty much the same as this, which is you create something of type m.asset, you provide a bunch of attributes and relationships. But one of the biggest thing you would need to do for an asset is to specify a public URL from which you pull in the actual asset. Now, like I mentioned, depending on the weight of the asset, it might take, Content Hub a few seconds to a minute or more for that matter, depending on your instance size. Mine is a dev instance, so it'll take longer. It's not as beefy. But if I'm pulling in something, a video of 500 meg, it might take quite longer. So we create the asset, do a bunch of things, add a bunch of relationships. But when we try to create a fetch job to say, go fetch this asset with this URL, we are basically sitting and waiting for it before we get the public link for it. So, you know, it basically adds a message to a queue, it sits for 15 seconds, checks again, checks again, checks again. All of these are happening multi-threaded and individual. So I can push 20,000 messages into the queue and all of them will individually finish when they finish. So they're not dependent on a specific machine. So when the asset does finish fetching, we push it to a different queue where we create the public link for it, and then it gets consumed. So that's kind of the reason why I choose to do it in Azure Functions, and that's specific to my use case if you're especially doing migration perspective. But if depending on what you do, it might be a little bit different. And again, I love working in Visual Studio, but then I don't write functions and scripts for Content Hub itself. So Content Hub by itself has a script section where you can write code inside of the editor in Content Hub. But in order to test it, so someone like Chris usually uses Visual Studio Code script files. They're easy to run, they're individual, you can test them out, works fine in his use case, but I haven't gotten to that yet. So for me, the Visual Studio solution helps me in my part of it.
The thing to note is that the code is pretty much, regardless of whether you're doing it inside a Content Hub or here or in Visual Studio Code, the code is all the same. The only difference is if you go back to your code again, Akshay.
Yeah.
So you'll notice here it says mconnector, and it has the like that definition there. In Content Hub script, it already defines that for you, right? So that rest of the code would all be the same. It's just the only difference here, or if you're doing it in Visual Studio Code, is that you're making that mconnector variable, yep. Right? Other than that, it's exactly the same. So you could test this in Visual Studio Code with one, make sure it works, debug it, all of that stuff, and then put it in your Azure function or, you know, Sitecore Commerce or wherever you need it.
Yeah. All right. With that, I think I'm almost to the end. I can definitely answer your questions, but one thing I wanted to mention is we're doing a couple of webinars in the next month, mainly dealing with products and assets, and how do you deal with thousands of products sitting all over the place? How does your organization deal with just mass amounts of content, going through some use cases? So Chris and I are doing the presentation, both regions, so NA and APAC. And then Dennis and I are doing another webinar, which is related to walking through the different stages of, you know, thinking about Content Hub, the whole process of getting it, what happens after you get it, the process of domain models, getting it implemented, and just knowing what exactly happens and migration strategies and things like that. So if you're interested, or if your customer is interested, or you guys are looking into it, be sure to go to konabos.com/webinars and you can sign up for any of these. They're free, so obviously not charged. This is why Sumit is on this. He wanted to make sure that I'm doing my job. So we have a presentation and symposium talking about connectors, so, right? Specific to Sitecore CMS, there's existing connectors for DAM and content CMP. CMP connectors, latest version dropped earlier this week or last week. I remember I posted it, but there's new features coming. There's a lot more exciting features coming. So I'm looking forward to it myself, but I am glad that I get to present it with Sumit. Sumit owns the delivery for those and many more things, I would imagine. But it's an interesting topic to talk about, how exactly you're thinking about content. And one of the most frustrating parts, and I know Sumit and Chris and whoever does Content Hub shares this pain with me, is the misconception of the way people look at content. We're so focused on the web channel that we don't look at content as a whole, content as something which can be used on multiple channels. The same piece of content can be used in different ways, like in social, syndicating it to a third-party website, and your own website, as well as your corporate website, things like that. So it gives you a good overview of how to look at content and how exactly you would want to sync it to your XP and use it. So it's a good presentation if you're looking or if you're interested in that. And again, this is some information about Konabos or our channels. So if you're interested in any of the content, you can subscribe. And as usual, you can always reach out to me via Slack or Twitter or LinkedIn. I'm more than happy to help you guys. With that, I will stop, and any questions you guys have other than licensing, I'm more than happy to answer your questions. Another quiet group, no questions. I must have done a wonderful job, which I know I didn't. All right, Bala and Madhura.
Well, I'll ask one then if no one's going to ask. How have you been doing with the Azure functions? How are you doing debugging? Like, how are you?
Yeah, so that's a cool thing about Azure Functions. And one of the best things about Azure Functions is depending on, as long as you don't do an Azure function, which you can't emulate locally. So the Azure Functions emulator, which you get with the SDK, you can pretty much execute any of these locally, timed functions, queued functions, HTTP triggers. So you can execute those and test them locally, and it's super easy. You don't even need an Azure subscription for it. That's how easy it is. So yeah, I mean, I just debug everything locally, and it makes it easier. Once I'm done, I push the functions and publish them to Azure Functions once I'm done with it. All right, anyone else?
I might ask a question around the integration, like you showed a .NET app. I was just curious, like, what do you see as a practical integration that in a real world scenario we would be using this?
Practical scenario of what? Sorry, can you repeat that?
Like the Content Hub integration.
Yeah.
You know, we do have the Content Hub to Sitecore connector, but I'm just thinking on
how about using Content Hub as a CMS?
Okay, I'm going to build a Power App or something. I'm going to utilize Content Hub.
So you could look at it several ways, right? So you're talking about integration from a different perspective. So I just showed you one, which I forgot to show. So this is like an ASP.NET Core MVC app, which is consuming content. So it's disconnected, obviously, right? So I'm using content as a service in a way, but it's doing an API call, pulling all the content from Content Hub, and I'm able to render a web page with it. So think about all the different kind of channels, right? Don't think about just web. So assume you have third-party vendors who are selling your products, third-party websites who are syndicating your piece of content. So you could have an API feed which only pulls all articles which are at least a week old. So on your site, you want to just show articles which are brand new and latest, but your syndicated partners, you want to show that. So for syndication purposes, for integration purposes, so you have pieces of content inside of Content Hub, but you need to integrate it back into your CRMs, back into your other systems, as well as your service provider systems. You could do that. So the implications, pretty much you could just think of any use case and you should be able to use the external integration to do it. And again, that comes back to things from looking at it purely from a web perspective, right? So think about running a campaign. You're launching, I don't know, a new toothpaste in a month. You're not just pushing website content, articles on how good it is if we brushed our teeth 3 times a day, but you're also doing social media posts, right? So you could have an integration. So based on a specific content type, which is social media posts getting into the published state, you could write an integration into from Azure Function or whatever that is, which will pull that piece of content and then push it to Twitter automatically. So your content authors don't have to do it. Or you could have one Facebook, one for LinkedIn. So that's just like a couple of simple examples of automation of how you can use these integrations to make your lives easier. I spend so much time on Twitter and LinkedIn, which I hate, because every time I'm running a hackathon, every time I'm doing a blog post, I have to create these things, post it on LinkedIn, on this group, on that group, on this in Facebook and that in Twitter. What would be nice is if I just said, you know what, I created this blog post and I will hit publish. And when I hit publish, I want it to take X, Y, and Z fields and push it to the blog post on my website. And then I also wanted to take the title and the metadata and push it automatically to Twitter and LinkedIn using the Konabos handles. And then my own handle, it needs to push to the Sitecore Guild and Sitecore groups in Facebook. And you can actually do that. If I had the time, I would actually probably end up doing it. But think about how easy that made it for your content marketing people who are building this content. You're just basing it off of different things inside of a workflow to automatically syndicate this content without having to manually do it.
The other thing too to think of is that we're thinking about content coming from here and going outside.
Yeah.
But if you're a B2C company, you're likely getting assets and documents from other B2B vendors. Like say for your products, you may have instruction manuals and specs and other different types of reports that are coming in from other systems, or maybe coming from your internal document management system like a SharePoint that can be pushed into Content Hub, so it's all in one spot, so that someone looking for a product can find everything in the single point of truth rather than trying to look in 10 or 15 different systems. So you can use this API from SharePoint or from wherever to push that kind of information in as well. And then from PCM perspective, you can push your products from your PIM or your ERP system or stuff like that to be able to align that with your products. So there's lots of other pieces, other places where you're pulling data from, not just taking your data from inside a Content Hub and pushing it out via the API, right? So that's where this can come into play as well.
Yeah, at least that makes sense. Even with this user group and stuff, we have to do a lot of manual things. Actually, I hear you on that part.
Yep. Any other questions, guys? Not, thank you so much for taking your time and attending the user group. And thanks for having me present at your user group as well.
Thank you, Akshay. Thank you, Chris.
Akshay. Thank you, Chris. Thanks everyone who joined.
Yeah, this is I don't really have a question. I just wanted to say thank you. And really the reason I have a question is because I haven't really had an opportunity to get into the hub yet. And there was a lot of information there. So I'm glad this is being recorded because I'd like to just go through it at my own pace and listen to it all again. But it was a very informative presentation. So thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. All right, guys, have yourself a wonderful evening.
Thank you, guys.
All right, bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Yeah, thanks.
Bye.